EPRO Services Incorporated AD55 sprayer is a palletized sprayer that can be connected to any tote or drum to apply EPRO products. All the components of the sprayer are designed for years of service. A key component of the sprayer is the Wayner pump. What we will be demonstrating is the installing of a rebuilt kit on the EPRO pump made by Wayner Industries. We are doing this demonstration with a new pump. There will be no emulsion. However, when doing pump repair in the field, there will be some dried and liquid emulsion that can cause a bit of a mess. Also, oil could flow out of the inside of the pump. Take precautions not only to contain the spills, but also to protect your skin and clothing. This is a rebuilding kit. It contains the following: diaphragms, O-ring followers, outer manifold O-ring, inner manifold O-ring, center bolt O-ring, valve seat O-rings, valve seats, valves, valve springs, Tetra seals, and valve spring retainers. It may not be necessary to install all the parts from this kit into the pump. However, after cleaning, if there are any parts that when you look at them appear to be damaged, stretched, or weakened, they should be replaced. The tools needed for the rebuilding of the pump include a 9/16 socket and/or box wrench, short and long-handled slot and Phillips screwdrivers, a hammer, a 3/16, 5/16, and 3/32 Allen wrench. This repair is at the fluid end of the pump. First, remove all the bolts around the manifold. To do this, a 9/16 wrench and a 5/16 Allen wrench is needed. Each bolt has two washers, one on the head side of the bolt and one on the nut side. Caution: these bolts may be very tight and may take significant pressure to remove them. It's a good idea, if space permits, to leave the pump bolted down during the removal of the manifold. It keeps the pump stable. Next, using a 3/8" Allen wrench, remove the center bolt and washer. Since the manifold is now loose, hold it securely. When the manifold is removed from the pump, you may notice it is full of liquid emulsion and dried emulsion. Remove all these materials from the manifold. After clearing of all materials from the pump, you may notice one or all of the valves are stuck. To test proper operation of the valves, push each valve in with your finger. They recess about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch. The valves are spring-loaded, so they just pop in and out. When valves are stuck, they will not pick up the flow. To release these valves, apply WD-40 around the valves and gingerly work them back and forth until they are loose. Spray again with WD-40 and continue pushing each valve in and out until they are free. Note: because this is a new pump, you will notice there is water coming out of these valves. This is a result of water being used during factory testing. When the manifold is removed from a pump in the field, there may be dried material in the valve spring retainer. If this occurs, the retainer may be very difficult to remove. Do not pry or apply too much pressure to pull out the valve spring retainer. They are plastic and can be easily broken. In some cases, spraying the valve spring retainer with WD-40 may be required. Behind the valve spring retainer is the valve spring, the valve, and the Tetra seal. If there is a significant amount of material that needs to be cleaned from the manifold and solvents are used, these 3 O-rings need to be checked. This is because if these O-rings are exposed to a heavy concentration of solvent, they may expand, and reinstalling them into this pump may be very difficult. Thus, it is a good idea to keep an extra set of O-rings on hand to install in the manifold. Reassembly of the manifold to the pump will be covered in a later chapter. At this point, we are going to remove the valve plate. The 2 Allen screws at approximately 9 and 3 o'clock are removed. The valve plate is now loose from the pump. However, when removing the valve plate, be careful. There could be a slight adhesion of the diaphragms to the back of the valve plate. Pulling too hard may ruin one or more of the diaphragms. The possibility exists they might be bad anyway, but it's a good idea to be cautiously aggressive. The valve plate may need to be placed into a tub of solvent or parts cleaner prior to valve removal. Remember, when removing the valve retainer, do not apply too much pressure. These are plastic and could be broken. Behind the valve spring retainer is the valve spring, the valve, and the Tetra seal. Remove the other two exterior valves. Next, remove the three interior valves. To remove the interior valves, something small and thin is needed. A very small flathead screwdriver or a small Allen wrench, as shown here, will work. Place the Allen wrench down between the plastic, not against the plastic. When in position, tap it lightly with a hammer. The external and internal components are identical. There is, however, an additional piece in the internal valve. It is called the valve seat. Remove the valve seat, the valve spring, the Tetra seal, and the valve spring retainer. Now remove the two other interior valves. At this point, it is a good idea to put something under the pump to catch the oil in the pump. The pump contains approximately 1 quart of oil. When pulling a diaphragm away from the pump, oil leakage is likely to occur. There are 3 diaphragms that cause the pump to move fluid. Visually inspect each diaphragm to see if any or all need to be replaced. There may have been disfiguration of the diaphragm due to increased pressure, or impurities in the material that came through and damaged the diaphragm. Typically, if there is a damaged diaphragm, it is because during pump operation, oil is leaking out. If there is a break or cut in a diaphragm, replace it. Visually inspecting the oil reservoir is the only way to know if oil has been leaking. Remove the cap and visually check the oil level. If the goal is to remove a diaphragm without damaging it, use a Phillips head screwdriver and a small straight tool such as a small Allen wrench. Gently pull the diaphragm away from the pump, and a small hole on the shaft becomes visible. Place the Allen wrench or a small tool into the hole and hold the shaft in place while unscrewing the Phillips screw located in the center of the diaphragm. If the diaphragms are bad and are being thrown away, grab the diaphragm with a pair of pliers and pull them away from the pump. In order to replace the diaphragm, the follower that holds it in place needs to be removed. This completes the removal of the manifold and valve plate from the pump housing. Annotation: there are 2 bolts on the hydraulic side, the opposite end of the fluid end of the pump, that will not be removed at any point during this process. If the diaphragms are not being replaced, be sure to carefully inspect each of the diaphragms for any damage. Also, when installing the diaphragm into the pump housing, be sure that the raised side of the diaphragm is turned away from the pump. When replacing a diaphragm in the pump housing, use a small tool such as an Allen wrench. Place the tool into the hole on the shaft to prevent the shaft from turning, while using a Phillips screwdriver to connect the diaphragm to the pump housing. Be sure to place the follower in front of the diaphragm. Next, let's reassemble the inner and outer valves of the valve plate. The parts for both the internal and external valves are identical, except for the addition of a valve seat in the interior valve assembly. Lay the valve plate on a flat surface. To assemble the inner valves, insert the valve spring retainer. Next, place the seal into the valve plate. Then the valve spring, the valve, and finally the valve seat. Cover the valve seat with a thin coat of oil before inserting. Gently tap the valve seat into place until it is flush with the valve plate as shown. For review, watch the last valve assembly being reinserted. Next, reassemble the exterior valve assemblies. First, insert the seal, then the valve, then the valve spring, and finally the valve spring retainer. Since the valve spring retainer is plastic, always be sure to inspect it for damage. If it is damaged, replace it. For review, watch the last valve assembly being reinserted. One final note. Be sure that the V in the valve spring retainer for each valve is pointed toward the center. At this time, check the oil level of the pump and add oil if needed. The oil level should be filled to the bottom of the rectangular cavity. Be sure you have something under the pump to catch oil that will be displaced during the next step. Bleeding of the diaphragms. Depress all three of the diaphragm centers with one hand as shown here. With your other hand, rotate the shaft on the hydraulic end of the pump. Keep rotating the shaft until oil comes out of all of the diaphragms. The bleeding of the diaphragms is now complete. Place the valve plate against the pump and reattach it by means of two Allen head screws at 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock. It is easier to place the Allen head screws into the valve plate first. Once again, check the oil level of the pump and add oil to replace the oil used for bleeding the pump. Three O-rings now need to be placed into the backside of the manifold. If there was a significant amount of material that needed to be removed from the manifold and solvents were used, these three O-rings need to be checked. This is because if these O-rings are exposed to heavy concentration of solvent, they may have expanded, and reinstalling them into this pump will be very difficult. Thus, it is a good idea to keep an extra set of O-rings on hand to install in the manifold. If there is any doubt about the condition of the O-rings, replace them. It is now time to replace the manifold. Place the manifold against the valve plate and reattach it by means of the 3/8 Allen head bolt in the center of the manifold. Do not tighten. Next, install each of the 6 Allen head bolts, washers, and nuts. Be sure there is a washer on the head and nut end of the bolt. After installing the 6 bolts, tighten them in an alternating way, much in the same way as a wheel is tightened on a car. Be sure the center bolt is tightened, but do not over-tighten. If for any reason oil needs to be drained from the pump without disassembling, use the drain plug located on the side of the pump. Also, these 2 bolts should not be removed during any of the processes we have demonstrated in this presentation. Final check. Rotate the shaft on the hydraulic side of the pump. If all is working properly, you should hear a pop from each of the diaphragms as you rotate the shaft. This is very important.